On March 6, 2013, the quiet town of Fairfield, Connecticut, was thrust into a horrifying scandal that would forever change its community. Daniel Weaver, a respected undertaker with decades of experience, was arrested after the discovery of his dark and perverse secret. What started as whispers about his odd behavior spiraled into a chilling case of necrophilia, exposing how a seemingly ordinary man harbored disturbing desires for the dead. But it wasn't just his own life that would unravel. His wife's mysterious illness and the eventual revelation of a brutal murder would leave the entire town reeling. Daniel Weaver had always been the pillar of his small community. For 3 decades, he had quietly maintained his role as Fairfield's undertaker, a man who dealt with death daily but never let it affect him outwardly. His calm, composed demeanor earned him respect, and no one ever questioned his methods. Behind the scenes, though, Daniel's life was far more twisted than anyone could have imagined. The work that made him a trusted figure in the town also gave him an outlet for the dark desires he struggled to hide, desires that centered around the very dead bodies he was entrusted with. Daniel's fascination with the dead began early in his career. It started as curiosity, a way to understand the human form in death. But over the years, his curiosity grew into something far more disturbing. By the time he reached his 50s, Daniel had developed a necrophilic fetish, a psychological condition that pushed him to seek physical gratification from the bodies he handled. For years, he found ways to act on his desires undetected, using his position as an undertaker to hide his compulsions in plain sight. Each time a body came into his care, he felt a pull he could no longer resist. His meticulous attention to detail, once a mark of his professionalism, became a way to cover up his activities. And for years, no one knew. Martha Weaver, Daniel's wife, had always been fragile. She had suffered from recurring illnesses, and as she grew older, her health seemed to decline at an even faster rate. By 2012, her once minor ailments had become something much more serious. Martha frequently found herself bedridden, her body growing weaker with every passing month. She was plagued by a mysterious bacterial infection that puzzled doctors. At first, they believed it was a simple case of pneumonia or some other common illness. But as her symptoms worsened, the infection began to seem more unusual, defying their treatments. The infection eventually spread, and Martha was admitted to the hospital several times throughout 2012. The doctors ran test after test, but no one could determine the source of the bacteria ravaging her body. She lost weight rapidly, her skin turning pale, her once vibrant eyes clouding with exhaustion. Daniel remained by her side throughout it all, appearing to be the devoted husband, though in truth, his mind was often elsewhere, drawn to the morbid allure of his secret world. While Martha struggled with her health, Daniel continued his work, growing bolder in his necrophilic activities. As 2012 turned to 2013, Martha's condition worsened dramatically. By early March, her body could no longer fight the infection, and on March 4th, 2013, she passed away. The doctors were unable to identify the bacteria that had caused her death, marking it down as an unusual but ultimately unexplained medical mystery. Martha's passing was a tragedy, but no one suspected any foul play. Even Daniel, now a widower, seemed to grieve normally, taking time away from his work to process the loss. But within days of Martha's death, a new body arrived at Daniel's funeral home. On March 6, 2013, a local woman who had passed away from a heart attack was brought in for preparation. It was a routine job, like many Daniel had handled before. But on that night, Daniel's behavior crossed a line that would lead to his downfall. He allowed himself to indulge in his darkest desires, fully believing that his secret would never be discovered. However, one of his part-time employees, Andrew, was also working late that night, assisting with the preparations. Andrew had been working at the funeral home for only a few months and had never seen anything out of the ordinary until that night. As he went about his duties, Andrew noticed Daniel acting strangely. At first, he tried to brush it off as nothing, perhaps just Daniel working through his grief in an odd way. But then Andrew saw something he couldn't ignore. Daniel was engaging in deeply inappropriate and disturbing behavior with the newly deceased woman. Andrew's initial shock turned to disbelief, and then horror as he realized what he had witnessed. Unsure of what to do, he left the funeral home without confronting Daniel, but the image of what he had seen stayed with him. The next day, Andrew reported the incident to the police, struggling to come to terms with what he had witnessed. His report was the beginning of the end for Daniel Weaver. On March 8, 2013, local authorities, led by Detective Clara Hayes, opened an investigation into the funeral home. The officers arrived discreetly, not wanting to alarm the town, but as soon as they began their search, they uncovered far more than they had expected. In the basement of the funeral home, they found a hidden collection of evidence, photographs, recordings, and documents detailing Daniel's necrophilic activities over the years. Daniel had kept meticulous records, labeling each with the date and name of the deceased. The authorities were horrified by the level of planning and control he had exerted over his crimes. As the investigation unfolded, forensic experts were called in to analyze the evidence, including Martha's medical records. It didn't take long for the truth to surface. Martha had been exposed to the same bacteria commonly found in corpses, likely through direct contact with contaminated clothing or surfaces. It was a sickening realization. Daniel's vile actions had not only desecrated the dead, but had also indirectly led to the death of his own wife. Her mysterious infection, which had baffled doctors for months, was now understood to be the result of her exposure to the bacteria Daniel had brought home from the funeral home. On March 12, 2013, Daniel was brought in for questioning. He remained calm and emotionless throughout the interrogation, denying any wrongdoing. At first, he claimed that he had done nothing improper, dismissing the accusations as a misunderstanding. But as the investigators presented more evidence, including the photographs and videos found in his basement, Daniel's composed demeanor began to crack. By March 20th, 2013, the police had gathered enough evidence to arrest him. He was charged with multiple counts of abuse of a corpse, and as more details emerged, the town of Fairfield was left reeling from the revelation that their trusted undertaker had been hiding such a dark secret for years. Detective Hayes and her team continued their investigation, piecing together the full extent of Daniel's crimes. Each new piece of evidence uncovered added to the horror. The case became the talk of the town, with people questioning how someone they had trusted for so long could have hidden such a disturbing secret. Families who had once entrusted their loved ones to Daniel's care began to wonder if their own relatives had been violated. The funeral home, once a respected institution, became the epicenter of a scandal that shook the town to its core. By the time Daniel's trial began, the town was divided between those who wanted to forget the whole ordeal and those who demanded justice for the dead. But no one could deny the lasting impact of what had been uncovered. The once quiet and composed undertaker had become a symbol of twisted perversion, and the truth about his secret life would haunt the town for years to come. Daniel Weaver's journey into darkness had not begun overnight. It had been a gradual descent, one that took years to reach its most disturbing depths. Daniel's obsession with the dead started subtly, almost innocently. In his early years as an undertaker, he found himself captivated by the stillness and quiet of death. It wasn't just about handling the bodies with care, ensuring they were ready for their final farewell. For Daniel, there was something almost comforting in the absence of life, a space where the complications of living no longer existed. At first, he dismissed these thoughts as part of the job. His work required him to confront death daily, and his fascination seemed like a natural curiosity. But as the years went on, those thoughts began to twist into something darker. He started to fixate on the bodies he worked with, not as people who once lived, but as objects of his desires. The more he worked, the more these fantasies grew. What started as fascination became something far more disturbing, an irresistible urge that he could no longer suppress. The dead, he reasoned, could not reject him. They could not deny him the control he craved. By the mid-2000s, Daniel's fantasies had fully transformed into compulsions. He had learned how to compartmentalize his life, appearing as the calm and collected professional on the outside, while inside his dark urges festered. He had never shared these thoughts with anyone, not even Martha, his wife of 25 years. She had always seen him as a quiet, introverted man who found solace in his work. Martha, though supportive, remained oblivious to the fact that her husband's growing detachment had nothing to do with stress or long hours, but with the secret world he had built for himself in the funeral home's basement. Daniel managed to hide his condition for years. He created a methodical system that allowed him to act on his desires without raising suspicion. He always made sure to clean up meticulously, erasing any physical evidence of his actions. He documented everything privately, labeling each photo, each video, with the date and name of the deceased. He found some twisted satisfaction in keeping these records, knowing that they were hidden from everyone, including Martha. Martha's illness in 2012 was the first sign that Daniel's secret world was beginning to collapse. She had always been fragile, but the infection that struck her was something altogether different. At first, doctors thought it was pneumonia or some rare bacterial strain that she had picked up in the community. But as the months dragged on, Martha's condition worsened, and her doctors became more baffled. She spent weeks in and out of hospitals, undergoing treatment after treatment, none of which seemed to make any difference. Each time she came home, her body was weaker, her spirit dimmer. As Martha lay bedridden, Daniel continued his work, slipping further into his compulsion. He never considered the possibility that his actions with the corpses could have contaminated his home or affected Martha's health. It wasn't until after her death in March 2013 that the connection between her illness and Daniel's necrophilia would become tragically clear. The bacteria she had contracted was traced back to the dead bodies Daniel had handled, specifically the ones he had desecrated. It was a horrific revelation. Martha had unknowingly suffered the consequences of her husband's secret fetish. The trial of Daniel Weaver became one of the most highly publicized cases in Fairfield's history. By the time May 5th, 2013 arrived, the town was buzzing with news about the undertaker who had committed such unspeakable acts. Daniel had been arrested in March after weeks of investigation, and as the evidence piled up, it became clear that the case was far more disturbing than anyone had anticipated. In court, Daniel was charged with multiple counts, including desecration of bodies, illegal abuse of a corpse, and improper handling of the dead. But perhaps the most chilling charge was the indirect role he played in his wife's death. Martha's illness had been a mystery at first, but now, in the harsh light of the courtroom, it was being exposed as one of the many tragic outcomes of Daniel's actions. The bacteria that had infected her body, the illness that doctors couldn't treat, it had all been caused by her exposure to the cadaveric bacteria Daniel had carried home with him. The prosecution laid out the grim details. For years, Daniel had taken advantage of his position, violating the sanctity of the bodies entrusted to his care. His meticulous documentation became a key piece of evidence. Photos and videos, all labeled with dates and names, showed just how methodical Daniel had been in his desecration. The record stretched back years, revealing the depth of his compulsion. It was not a sudden sickness, but something that had grown and festered over time, unchecked. Andrew, the part-time employee who had discovered Daniel in the act on the night of March 6, 2013, provided the most shocking testimony. In court, he recounted how he had walked in on Daniel, thinking nothing of it at first, only to realize that what he was witnessing was far beyond inappropriate. Andrew's account left the courtroom in stunned silence. His testimony painted a picture of Daniel as a man who had shown no remorse, who had continued his acts without a second thought for the dignity of the dead. The prosecution argued that Daniel's actions were not just about necrophilia, but about control. He had violated the bodies because they could not fight back, and this gave him a sense of power. The most devastating part of the trial came when the prosecution linked Daniel's actions to Martha's death. Her passing, which had once seemed like an unfortunate and unexplained medical mystery, was now being framed as the consequence of Daniel's depravity. Martha had been a victim, not just of the bacteria, but of the world her husband had hidden from her for years. As Daniel sat in the courtroom, he remained mostly emotionless. He had never shown any remorse for his actions, even as the evidence mounted against him. The only time he seemed to react was when Martha's name was mentioned. But even then, his expression was cold, distant. It was as though the man who had once been Fairfield's trusted undertaker had long since vanished, replaced by someone hollowed out by years of secrecy and compulsion. By the end of the trial, the community of Fairfield had been left reeling. The town's quiet streets, once home to families who trusted Daniel with their loved ones, were now filled with whispers about how someone could hide such darkness for so long. The trial exposed not just Daniel's crimes, but the way in which he had managed to deceive everyone around him, hiding in plain sight. For those who had lost loved ones, the horror of imagining what Daniel might have done to their relatives was unbearable. On June 28, 2013, Daniel was convicted on all charges. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The trial might have ended, but the scars it left on the community were deep and lasting. People continued to talk about the case for years, not just because of the gruesome details, but because it revealed the terrifying truth that monsters could live among them, hiding behind ordinary lives. As Daniel Weaver's trial reached its final stages in June 2013, the focus shifted to his mental state. His defense team had been desperately trying to paint a picture of a man struggling with an uncontrollable psychological disorder, necrophilia. On June 20th, 2013, a psychologist took the stand to explain that Daniel's behavior was driven by deep-seated compulsions. The expert delved into Daniel's condition, describing how his urges had grown stronger over the years, evolving from mere fascination into full-blown obsession. According to the psychologist, Daniel's actions were not motivated by malice, but by an illness he had hidden from the world, perhaps even from himself. This psychological testimony was intended to garner sympathy from the jury, but it had the opposite effect. The people of Fairfield, who filled the courtroom every day, were not interested in hearing about mental illness. To them, Daniel's position as an undertaker, a role they had trusted him with for decades, meant that he was supposed to protect the dignity of the dead. They could not forgive him for violating that trust. The town was outraged, and the jury shared that sentiment. As the trial continued, it became clear that no amount of psychological testimony could change what Daniel had done. He had desecrated bodies, violated the most basic respect for the dead, and his actions had contributed to the death of his own wife, Martha. Though the psychologist tried to frame Daniel's actions as the result of an uncontrollable disorder, the jury remained unmoved. They saw Daniel not as a man who had lost control of his compulsions, but as someone who had coldly and methodically indulged in his sick desires for years, all while keeping up the appearance of normalcy. The courtroom was filled with palpable tension as the trial approached its conclusion. The community had been torn apart by the revelations, and many people who had once respected Daniel now demanded answers about what really went on inside his funeral home. By June 28, 2013, the verdict was finally delivered. Daniel Weaver was convicted on all charges, including desecration of bodies, illegal abuse of corpses, and contributing to the circumstances that led to his wife's death. His sentence was life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. When the sentence was handed down, Fairfield breathed a sigh of relief. Daniel was removed from society, locked away where he could never again harm the deceased. But the damage he had caused would continue to haunt the community for years to come. The verdict may have brought justice, but it didn't bring peace. The trust the townspeople had placed in Daniel was shattered, and the ripple effect of his actions was felt in every corner of Fairfield. The consequences of Daniel's crimes didn't end with his imprisonment. Fairfield, a once quiet and trusting community, had been permanently scarred by the scandal. The funeral home, which had served the town for decades, was shut down almost immediately after Daniel's conviction. Families who had once entrusted their loved ones to Daniel's care were horrified by the idea that their deceased relatives may have been mistreated. Many demanded investigations into the handling of their family members' bodies, hoping for some kind of closure, though the thought of what might have happened was too painful for some to even bear. The local authorities were overwhelmed with requests to re-examine the bodies that had passed through Daniel's funeral home. Investigations were opened, but many families would never know the full truth of what Daniel had done. The uncertainty left a lingering unease over Fairfield. Some families chose to quietly move on, burying their grief with the hope that their loved ones had not been violated. Others couldn't let go, their suspicions growing with every passing day. The revelation that Martha's death had been an indirect consequence of Daniel's actions only added to the weight of the town's grief. For years, people had seen Martha as a quiet, unassuming woman who supported her husband through thick and thin. She had been well liked in the community, always polite, and never one to complain about her own declining health. Her death in March 2013 had been a somber event, and people had mourned her loss, believing it to be the result of an illness beyond anyone's control. But now the truth had come to light. Martha had unknowingly suffered because of her husband's vile acts. The bacteria that had infected her body, leading to her eventual death, had come from the very corpses Daniel had violated. This revelation left the townspeople with a deep sense of betrayal. Martha had been a victim, just like the deceased who had passed through Daniel's funeral home. But she had also been his wife, living in the same house, eating at the same table, completely unaware that the man she had loved for decades was responsible for her suffering. Fairfield was left reeling from the knowledge that someone they had trusted so deeply had destroyed lives, both the living and the dead. The local funeral industry, once thriving, took a massive hit. Other funeral homes in the area were now viewed with suspicion, as families questioned whether they could trust anyone with their loved ones. The scandal surrounding Daniel Weaver had cast a long shadow over the entire town. People whispered about it in church pews, at bars, and during social gatherings. It became a topic of hushed conversations, with townsfolk wondering how Daniel had managed to keep his secret for so long. How could someone who had seemed so normal be capable of such horrors? Over time, the Weaver case became a cautionary tale. People would bring it up when discussing trust, secrets, and how easily darkness can hide behind a calm, respectable facade. The funeral home that Daniel once ran remained closed, its windows boarded up, and the building became a symbol of the town's trauma. Fairfield struggled to heal, but the wounds left by Daniel's actions were deep and would take years to mend. Fairfield was left with the chilling question of what other secrets might be hidden behind closed doors. What other dark urges might be lying in wait, undetected, in the hearts of those who seemed most trustworthy. The story of Daniel Weaver became a lasting reminder that evil does not always announce itself. Sometimes it hides in plain sight, behind the mask of a quiet, unassuming man who had, for decades, fooled everyone around him. Even after Daniel's conviction, some questions lingered. How many bodies had been? The setting of the story takes place in rural Pennsylvania. Between the years 2000 to 2015, with a focus on the events of February to March, 2012.de, secreted before someone finally noticed. How long had his wife suffered in silence, unknowingly falling victim to her husband's twisted world? And, perhaps most chillingly, were there others like Daniel hiding in plain sight, waiting for their dark desires to be discovered? Of course, in our list of cases, we also have incredibly weird ones, such as the one where a teenage boy had an affair with 3 older neighbors and it ends badly. Don't forget to like and subscribe so you don't miss out on our daily updates.